Hello, my name is Joe Robinson. I am a visiting researcher working with the Junction right now. I'm currently also affiliated with the Alternative Dispute Resolution Center at the University of Oregon in the United States. I have a master's degree in European Studies from St. Petersburg State University, and I have another master's degree from Boston University in the US. This talk today is based on a paper I wrote with a co-author named Jennifer Hudson, also from the University of Oregon. We're going to be talking about restorative justice and the types and limitations and how it might be applied here in Northern Ireland. I'm really hoping to get a lot out of the talk. I'm hoping for some good debate in order to help people begin to start thinking about this weird concept and how they might apply it in their own work.
Hello everybody, afternoon. My privilege to introduce Joe, a colleague of mine. Joe's a researcher with the Alternative Dispute Resolution Center at the University of Oregon in the US. He's a sociologist, he's a political geographer. He has master's degrees from the University of St. Petersburg, to old wrinklies like me, that's Leningrad, and Boston University.
Not college.
Pardon?
Not college.
Not college. Okay. Now, currently Joe works upstairs as a researcher in evaluation at the Junction. And he very kindly shared with some of us a while back a paper that he had written along with Jennifer Hudson, also from Oregon. And the paper is entitled Restorative Justice, a Typology and a Critical Appraisal. I'll come to the critical appraisal bit in a moment, but just a word about restorative justice, or RJ. It has become part of the language of some of us. Whether in the face of the fact of the evidence that's abundant now, it takes about 100,000 sterling to lock somebody up in prison per year. And the other bit of evidence is that it's not working. The search is on for alternatives to what might be called punitive or retributive forms of justice in the search for alternatives. Beyond that broad field of the criminal justice scene, in terms of our critical need here to deal properly with the legacy of conflict, that of course includes justice for those who have suffered loss or injury. Now, in this field, questions are arising around what sort of justice is either possible or can really be made available to victims. What chance at this stage of evidence being assembled to lock up the perpetrators of the up to 95% of the crimes and the troubles that remain unsolved? And even if it was possible, of what value would it be for the victims to have the perpetrators serve the couple of months, quite honestly, that is all that they would serve under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement? Would it give them any closure? I'm just raising questions. And is there any other approach that would better meet the needs of victims for justice? So, these and other questions are what gives rise to much of the talk about restorative justice as an alternative resolution process. But for all the talk about restorative justice, there seems to be almost no consensus anywhere in the world as to what it is. And that's not helpful. At best, the term could end up as a trendy buzzword. At worst, unless we know what we're talking about, it can be hijacked and manipulated and distorted in the service of personal or political interests. And that means further abuse of victims. So we need to ask, and what are we talking about? So it's this problem of restorative justice being ill-defined, lacking definition, lacking a critical approach that Joe and Jennifer address in their paper. And Joe's here to speak about it. Joe.
Thank you, Seamus. Just start again by thanking Seamus for the introduction and to thank Susan for inviting me. I want everybody to note the accent. I'm obviously not from here. This paper was written when we were at the University of Oregon, and it wasn't focused on Northern Ireland per se. Therefore, I'm very interested in getting a sense of the room. How many of you have heard of this thing called restorative justice? Can I get a show of hands? Okay. Now let me just hear a couple perspectives from people about what they think it means. Anybody want to volunteer? Yes, please.
Well, my perception of it, and I can't say it's really an awful lot, but my perception of it here is paramilitaries.
Okay.
Telling the community basically how you live.
That's lovely, Kate. Thank you very much. And I'm going to talk about that a bit because when we were writing this paper, we came across a citation from a, we didn't include it, unfortunately. I wanted to, but it didn't make one of the edits. From a Restorative Justice Northern Ireland coordinator. She was anonymous. It wasn't where it was. But what she said in it was, we continually have to tell people who come to us that, no, you've come to the wrong place if you want someone shot. It's not here. Now, I'm going to suggest that one of the reasons why restorative justice was seized on so much by Republican/loyalist groups because it in theory was something that was outside of the state, and the state wasn't trusted. Okay, so maybe that's why it came to be sort of embraced without really understanding what it was. So thanks, Kate. Yes.
I had two perceptions. One was that it is part of the state because you could have community service that's ordered by the court. But I thought there was another type of thing where, for instance, if somebody vandalized my house, it could be arranged by some third party, but not necessarily the state, that they're going to come and do up my garden or paint my house or something to,
Right.
recompense me for the damage they did. And
Right. Very good. So it reminds me of another anecdote I have from a school in upstate New York that decided that they wanted to introduce a restorative justice program in their middle school. A kid was accused of stealing money from people. This school's restorative answer to this was to make him wear a shirt that said, "I am a thief," for 6 weeks to school every day. And they trumpeted this as saying that this was restorative justice. This was something that it agreed on. It showed him what he had done wrong, and now he was reintegrated, right? You also raised another interesting question, which is, what's the role of the state in restorative justice? Is it ordered as a sanction of the court? Or is it something that exists outside of the state as well? I'm going to suggest that these are questions we don't have answers to at this moment. Okay? Which brings us to the difficulty in defining it. Is it a philosophy or is it a practice? Or is it both? Nobody agrees on this. Is it a means or an ends-based approach? So if you think about mediation, which a lot of you might know about, mediation is a means-based approach. Basically, mediation says that if the process is good, then the outcome in a sense doesn't even matter because the participants agreed on it themselves. But so much of the restorative justice literature is focused on outcomes, specifically decreasing recidivism, right? Recidivism means the rate of reoffending. So what is it? Again, no conclusions. Is it focused on healing individuals or is it focusing on making better communities? Can it do both? Should it do both? What sorts of crimes or violations can be addressed using RJ? What can't? So at this point, restorative justice is mostly used across the world with juvenile offenders or people who have committed very low-scale crimes like property damage or something like that. But can it be used to address murder? Can it be used to address rape? Can it be used to address domestic violence? These are things we don't have answers to. And I've mentioned this before. Should RJ be separate or integrated from the state? In its original conception, RJ was thought of as a radical alternative to state justice. The state couldn't get its hooks in it, couldn't get its claws in it, lest it corrupt it. But lately, the literature's been saying that's, well, less and less possible. So, without answering these questions, and this is what Seamus said in his introduction, restorative justice risks becoming an Alice in Wonderland type concept, where it can mean anything you want it to, and it can be defined by the loudest voice in the room. This is problematic, And this is what a lot of this paper is about. So you see this sort of dichotomy here that you hear very common. Restorative justice is kid-friendly, but the punitive approach is bad, right? It's not that simple, I'm going to suggest, in this paper. So there's only three themes that restorative justice practitioners have ever been able to agree upon. So traditionally, in kind of the Blackstonian worldview, crime wasn't a violation of an individual person. It was a violation of the state and the community's codes of justice that were then codified into law. Everybody suffered, and therefore it was the state who was the primary victim, and the state who was primarily responsible for addressing the harm. Restorative justice says, wait, hold on a minute. These are individuals here, and individuals who have suffered. They have to be returned the right to deal with their own conflicts, right? It can't be just about the state. And as you also mentioned, there's also a component in this that people who have offended have obligations to correct the harm. That's the other thing that they've been able to agree on. And finally, both offenders and victims are stakeholders in the process. But these are really vague. And they're the only three things that they've ever been able to agree upon. So what does this mean, problems? Again, Seamus stole a bit of my thunder. We agree that flexibility is generally good. Generally good. But when you have no idea what, in fact, this concept means, the interventions that stem from it are inconsistent, they're confusing, they're often directionless, and there's no clear way to evaluate if they're working. Also because you might have no idea what, in fact, it means if they are working. How do we train people to participate in it? Increasingly, this is depending on volunteers and lay people. How do we train them? What if they have even less idea of what it is that what we're doing? And if we don't have a clear connection from a theory, namely what RJ is and what it's supposed to do, to a practice that is then supposed to do that, an RJ intervention runs the risk of being ineffective, meaningless, or worst of all, as Seamus again said, re-traumatizing. And let me give you an example of re-traumatizing. In 1984, I believe, a woman on the campus of the University of Virginia, United States, was raped by a fellow student. As you know anything about the history of the sordid history of sexual assault on U.S. campuses, nothing was done about it. The offender graduated, went on, got a high-paying job, and sometime around 2004, he entered a drug and alcohol abuse program. This was a new one that was very focused on restorative justice, and the facilitator told him that he had to make amends. And so what he did was he went and he wrote letters to his victim saying, look, I'm sorry for what I've done to you. The victim received these letters. What the hell? I didn't ask for this. Now, that woman, who I kind of admire very much, collected those letters and took them to the police, which I think would be a good way to go about that. And the man was convicted, but he was only sent to jail for 2 years, and only after a long trial in which she had to go through all the things that women have to go through when they're trying to prove a sexual assault that happened 20 years in the past. All right? Is this what restorative justice is supposed to be doing? So what we decided was, look, maybe part of the way that we can cut through all this is by creating a typology, separating the different forms of theory into different types. And so we came up with this one preliminarily. We found that there was a reintegrative strand of restorative justice. And it focused on offenders, people who had committed harm or violation. Okay? It had its specific examples of practice, and it came mainly from its own specific discipline, which was sociology or criminology. We found a psychotherapeutic strand that focused on survivors. Again, coming largely from psychology. In this main practice, these are not the only practices. Just for simplicity's sake, I focused on these. Focused mainly on storytelling. Communitarian, right? And this one we have coming largely from anthropology and peacemaking circles. And then we have this one, this weird one that I'll talk about at the end, called insurgent, which focuses on unjust social orders. So let me get into each one of these real quickly. The first one is justice as reintegration. Now, the major text that brought restorative justice into the mainstream was a book published in 1990 by a guy named Howard Zehr called Changing Lenses. Maybe some of you have heard of it. Zehr was a Mennonite in the United States, and which is a historic peace church. and he was focused on, he was working deep inside the American prisons and working with people who had committed horrible crimes, but who in turn were subjected to the most horrible forms of punishment, right? I probably don't need to tell you that much about American prisons, but you can imagine that they are hellscapes. This is not an exaggeration. They're characterized by endemic rape and violence, and people who are confined to them, Amnesty International once said that it's tantamount to torture to go to an American prison, okay? So Seamus said, and I agree, that restorative justice stemmed from a dual criticism of the American and the Anglo-American prison system. One, that it was immoral. The level of pain inflicted on people who were confined to prisons was wrong. And the other one was that it didn't work, that it was ineffectual, okay? Both of those, we cite a litany of sources in the paper to make that point. I don't really think that they need rehashing here. So what reintegration said was there had to be a better way. There had to be a better way to get people who had committed crime to be reintegrated into the communities from which they come without locking them up forever. And it also said that the people who commit crime, perpetrators, are also victims as well, okay? That violation, the act of violating another person, stems from sociological causes. It stems from poverty, it stems from deprivation, it stems from humiliation, it stems from inadequate attachment to communities or caregivers, right? And it said that reintegration could break this cycle of violence and punishment. Now, you probably know that punitive incarceration does not decrease recidivism. This is completely established. In fact, there's some evidence to suggest that it increases it, okay? So, if this is the way that we're going about it, we're not making a dent in crime by locking people up. In fact, we might be creating more crime. So this is where restorative justice came from originally. Now, the main practice I'm going to talk about in the reintegrative strand is called victim offender conferencing, okay? Victim offender conferencing is where a group of people, offenders, will participate in a discussion about the impact of crime and the impact of its harm, often led by a trained facilitator. Okay? It often takes place in prisons or in schools. Now, originally, there was this idea that the victim had to be present. Increasingly, this is becoming aware that you can't do that. You can't bring the victim in if they don't want to come in. So what they're using now is proxy victims. People who have been victimized by a similar crime in the past, but who are willing to participate and to serve as this kind of proxy for people to illustrate to people the harm that they've done. Okay? And we're going to see an example of this at the end. The goals of victim offender conferencing type practices are that offenders take responsibility for what they've done. They realize the impact and the suffering that they've caused, and ultimately, therefore, so it goes, that they can be reintegrated into the societies that they are and must be a part of. Okay? Does it work? Probably, but to an extent. When we went through the evidence, we weren't totally convinced. Both offenders and victims who participate in these type of practices say that they have higher satisfaction rates with these as opposed to their experience with the criminal justice system. Okay? And that you can show a decrease in recidivism, but only if the conference is not coerced, if they're not told to be there by a court or by somebody else. Only if they're there voluntarily. All right? We also worried that if these studies are only sampling people who are already participating, they're not sampling people who can't or won't or don't want to participate. And as such, maybe they're only measuring people who are already primed to be receptive to this idea. Okay? Problems. I've talked about it before. Reintegration is often coercive. Court-ordered restorative justice doesn't work. At least it doesn't work right now. Maybe sometime in the future. Now, reintegration is focused on that individual relationship between, say, Betty and I, right? It's focused on repairing that. It doesn't look wider than that. So, in that sense, it might be limited in scope and what it can achieve. And I'll talk about this a bit more later. There's a criticism that goes by the name net widening. Net widening means that if you have an individual who's committed a harm or a crime, he already has to go through the court. Now you're tacking on this other process that he has to go on to too. Well, what's the justice in that, right? It's expanding the scope of control over people. This criticism we're very partial to. This one's called the ideal victim. If you go through the restorative justice literature, you'll find all these anecdotes that are so loving about a victim who comes forward and forgives her offender and tells her story in the dominant form of language. And we were sitting there reading this, and I was sitting there with my co-writer, and my co-writer turned to me and she said, "This person doesn't exist." And yes, it's true. If you look at the socio-demographic profile of people that are harmed or offended, they tend to be poor. They tend to be people with disabilities. They tend to be, in the United States, they tend to be Black, Latino, of people of color. These don't fit these ideals of the heroic, noble white woman coming to tell her story, okay? But by creating these ideal victims in the literature, we might be setting ourselves up for some real failure. And finally, where does it stand in relationship to state justice? Do you involve the courts? Do you involve the police? At what level do you involve them, right? It can't answer these. Different people have different ideas, and different programs have different levels of state involvement. All right, let's go to the second strand. Justice is healing. This one has one primary proposition. Restoring the victim of harm to a healthful state of psychological well-being is the fundamental act of restorative justice. Other things can happen, but that's the goal. That has to be the goal. And if you know anything about the psychology of trauma, right, what these types of psychological processes focus on is rebuilding your sense of agency and empowerment that has been shattered by your traumatic experience, okay? And it focuses on rebuilding those worlds that are shattered and violated by the experience of going through trauma. That was a individual relationship between you and your therapist, your counselor, your psychologist, your family, your friends, your community. But what the psychotherapeutic strand of restorative justice tries to do is to scale that up a bit. And we focused on this one, storytelling. We said that already. And the idea of storytelling is that telling our stories to a supportive group of witnesses helps to rebuild those worlds and to rebuild those wider communities from which the trauma happened. Telling our story then makes the impact of the harm real on the perpetrator. And its goals are, again, recovery from trauma or recovery from what's happened to you. Does it work? Well, victims' experiences with heretofore restorative justice type things have not been great. Again, you have the evidence being generally positive, such as it is, but limited. And I want to read this quote to you. This is from one of the first and biggest attempts to sample victims who participated in restorative justice processes. Harry Mika et al. And his colleagues, this is from the Listening Project. Restorative justice provides little victim relief. While that objective appears to be a very low priority, there is nonetheless significant pressure and even coercion to have victims and victim services join the restorative justice bandwagon. Too often, and this should be familiar to everybody, funding for victims programs hangs in the balance. The choice may involve a direct affiliation with restorative justice programming or the process of no programming at all. So if you're a victims group in the United States, you either go and you affiliate yourself with the Restorative Justice Project or you don't get funded, is basically what he's saying. Now, as far as storytelling initiatives go, I have actually been looking at in my own work now how one might go about evaluating these things. And this is in its infancy. There was a conference at the University of Ulster a few years ago where they brought together a bunch of people, practitioners, who had tried to think about ways in which they might evaluate storytelling type practice. And I read the entire transcript of the conference. They didn't get anywhere, I guess we can say, with that. They had some ideas, but the simple fact is, to simplify, the evaluation of storytelling initiatives hasn't got to the point where, in the academic realm, where we should be. It needs to go further, I guess, is what I would say. All right, problems. I love this cartoon. I don't know if you could read it, but here's the part of the problem. If you want to take a restorative justice process and apply it to somewhere that doesn't have these like Anglo-European norms, well, you should be aware that Western psychological models, they're not universal, okay? This idea of individual healing from trauma that we know from people like Judy Herman and that sort of Western model, they've never heard of that in Africa. They've never heard of that in Asia. They've never heard of that in indigenous communities in the United States. It's not, it doesn't do anything for them. More importantly, if this is a totally victim-centric process, if you put offenders there, they might get their rights violated, right? They might be forced to confess to things which can then be used against them in court. They might be lectured or harangued or disempowered, right? Well, who cares about the offender? Well, again, if your goal is to try to reintegrate people or to decrease recidivism, this is something you should be aware of. Same criticism, again, is that individual person-to-person relationship. Doesn't look beyond it, at least in general. And finally, the language of victimization, which I satirize here. The basic point that I want to make with that is that not everybody who's been a victim or a survivor wants to be thought of as a victim. And that continuing to use the language of victimization around people can disempower them as well. In the early days, this sort of restorative justice type psychotherapeutic strand emphasized on forgiveness. It told victims that they couldn't move on unless they forgave their perpetrators. I want to suggest that that emphasis is totally misguided. All right? Forgiveness might be okay. It might be okay. It might be something that Betty wants to do. But you cannot be setting up a situation where that's what Betty's supposed to do. If that's what Betty's supposed to do, then you're coercing her into doing something for your own good, for your own structural or institutional good. And more importantly as well, recovery from trauma is complex. It's long. Sometimes you're never going to fully recover. So if we have a strand of restorative justice that is promising that victims can be healed, well, that might be misguided. That might be misguided. All right. Justice is community. This one might be. We found, when we looked through this, through the literature, we found that there was always these wide appeals to larger communities of meaning, but they were often quite vague. And when we actually went through it systematically, we found 5 places or groups of people who had their traditions and cultures held up as this ideal of restorative justice. Abrahamic faith, especially Judeo-Christian faith, the Navajo Nation, North American First Nations, Canadian and Northern European, or Northern American indigenous people, Australasian or Maori traditional practice, and familiar to everybody from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, this ideal of Ubuntu. And they all had some commonalities. They were designed to facilitate a shift from cognitive Western logic to empathic thinking, affective thinking, thinking with the heart. And interestingly enough, they were all supposed to be consensual. So if you are all stakeholders at this table, then we can't come to a decision on what to do or a way forward if everybody's on board, or at least if nobody's off board, okay? And you can think of that, if this is a community here, you can't leave somebody out of the community and expect to make progress. Well, which differentiates this from the other 2 strands I talked about is that individual health and well-being, sure, important, granted. But what's crucial is actually restoring this community here. A shared system of meaning-making spirituality and love, okay? In the Abrahamic frame, as you know, justice is symbolized as a covenant between man and God. That covenant is symbolized by the word shalom, the Hebrew word shalom, which means, usually translated as peace, but it can mean a lot more things as well. When an act of harm is committed, it violates that covenant between man and God that was symbolized by the Exodus, right? So the whole community then has the responsibility to repair that shattered relationship between man and God. And usually we're talking about peacemaking circles here. And again, I talked about this already. So restitution, punishment, rehabilitation, collectively deliberated and decided. And one of the things that makes communitarian practice so difficult to apply to our modern world is how long these can take. If you go to a Navajo healing ceremony, these can take months, months and months and months and months, right? So when restorative justices stand up and say, oh, look at these great Navajo in their system, we should be looking at that. How is that applicable to our fast-paced, quasi-urban lifestyles? Okay? These are things we need to be thinking about before we go and we say, let's all go subscribe to the Navajo Lifeway. The goals are: our community is repaired and the communal networks and relationships that hold it together are strengthened. All right. Does it work? No, not really. The first major attempt to inscribe a communitarian type justice into a national system was this thing called family group conferencing in New Zealand. And they took it from the Australasian or Maori ideals of Tingago Ngago Hara, I'm not going to pronounce that right, which was the kind of the life way of the Maori people, their system of justice. So they took that and they integrated it with state procedures. So actually in New Zealand now, if you're a juvenile, the police are required by law to first refer you to a family and group conference before you can go to court, before you can even be subjected to court. But what happened now, this was instituted in 1989, so what happened now these 25 some odd years later? Well, a lot of Maori advocates claim that FGCs are now being used primarily with white offenders and not Maori youth, and that they bear little resemblance to traditional practice. So what they claim is that the state has come in, taken these over, and co-opted them for their own purposes. Problems, a lot of problems. I'm going to start running through this a little bit quicker here. Cherry picking, I mentioned. You can't just take a unique culture or tradition and simplify it to solely its restorative facets. If you look at South Africa, for example, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they promoted this idea of Ubuntu, this traditional African thing that was the glue that holds society together. But they neglected to mention that actually punitive justice and execution has been just as essential a facet of Southern African cultures as well. So you're just taking this one thing that you like about it and holding it up. Co-optation, I talked about this as well. This is when the state comes and kind of says, that's a nice practice you got there. Let's see what we can do with that. Talked about this one as well. There's also a very important feminist critique of communitarianism. What feminists say is that these communal societies can be just as patriarchal, if not more so, than the states we live in now. And that many female victims went to the state because their rights were being violated by the communities in which they live. Okay? And this was why these things like due process and confronting your accusers developed in the first place. And what happens to those who don't accept community or control? What if I don't want to be a part of your community? What if, you know, I don't accept your right to, you elders' right to adjudicate what happens to me? Well, exile, I guess. And this is the final one. Restorative justice, as I mentioned before, has a radical strain to it. A very, very, very radical strain to it. Restorative justice is a form of insurgency because it competes with the state and power-based arrangements generally, and how it responds to interpersonal or intergroup conflicts, and how it defines what harm the human community should give restorative attention to in the first place. In other words, the state is bad. Restorative justice promises a radical alternative to state justice, state forms of categorizing crime and punishment, and all that type of stuff. When an insurgent theorist hears the phrase restorative justice, they often think this: restoration into what? Okay? So you've had your victim offender conference. Then what? You're going home into severed relationships, weak family structures, cycles of poverty and dependence, violence and abuse, into oppressive institutions and structures. Where's the justice in that? Restorative justice, to be a thing that can actually move to transform the worlds in which we live in, has to look big. It has to look big. It has to look at those whole relationships from which crime and punishment stem. Justice must be a means of social transformation in this view. And people must be empowered to own their own conflicts. When the state steps in and takes Betty and I's conflict away from us, the state is acting, according to one criminologist who we like a lot, as a thief It's stealing our right to own our own conflicts. Again, radical perspective. All right? So, yep. I want to give you an example. I've talked badly a bit about restorative justice in this. But let me give you an example of a process that might actually work. And I guess this is where we do the obligatory sort of trigger warning. It's not that bad, but it can be. This is a heavy stuff here. Oh, let me introduce it for a minute. This is the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The case in point is a case called the Gugulethu 7. Gugulethu 7 was 7 young activists who were murdered by apartheid forces. What you're going to see here is a black informer who infiltrated these groups, radicalized them, and then killed them. All right? He's come before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission asking forgiveness, and now he's asked to meet with the mothers of his victims. Oops. Oh, good God. Sorry. I was trying to go full screen. Nope.
Ngimuthabela umbheki ngami. Inamahloni nami kumjonga nje ebusweni. Yayazi ba kuhlungu ujonga umuntu kwenza ububi ukuthi ungathetha naye vele. Yayazi ngizoxela ixolo abanye bazangixolela abanye ngeke bangixolele. Yayazi izawufa nami inalonto ba nyani ke ndayenza ndayenza ububi nami apha emhlabeni. Into engicelayo bengisithi abazali bonke baba labantwana bebephaya nami. Ngicela uxolo ukusuka ngaphakathi kwenhliziyo yami. Ndiyaxolela abazali bami.
Ezazidumbu zazileli pha kabuhlungu izinyathelo athi umntana enyuse izandla esithi ndicela uxolo ndiyanikezela kodwa nimdubule ngaphezu koba ezinikezela umntana kodwa nimdubule ufila njani xa ngalamini wabona elaa nto phaa kwividiyo wafila njani yayinto ebuhlungu kuba how much more ukuthi bazali babantwana kwakunjani ke kuthi uyandibona mna namhlanje uyandibona ndingakanani nami ndibe ngenyama uyandibona ndingakanani ndandityebile uyandibona unqina kwa ndandityebile wena kokwenu konwatyiwe akho nto ingekhoyo kuba ufumana imali ezinjengemali ngenxa yokubulalisa igazi lakho ufila njani ukubulalisa igazi lakho endaweni uba bengowudifenda igazi lakho wabona uba mawubulala igazi lakho ngenxa yemali qha thengise ngegazi lakho ngenxa yemali ndimile kule ndawo
Bendinyanzekile besama nami kwenye imeko engeke ngikwazi uba ngiyayibamba phinde iyeke phi because nasemotweni bekhona abamhlophe vele bendicelelwa bendingaxeleli mna
kodwa ndiyayicinga laa nto uba ikhona laa nto uba ngabantu yakwethu apho le nto izokwenza baza kufaka kade ngoku laa nto kuwe ngoku uthi oyijonga ivakala njani kuwe nangelaa xesha sobajongile nangelo mihla ke ngoku bawa ngayo ithini isazela sabo xa sobajongile tata kumngaphakathi kuba noba beyintoni umtsala belahlongathi nja abenokholwa kuthiwa ipho laa rophu bebeyiphethele uba bababulala umntana bamtsala ngalahlo bamtsala ngalo laa nto mosibuku ingena kuthi ngaphakathi umntana wakhe lamshiyeyo utyatuni ufunda sombani babekude bona mna abafuna ukwazi bikeni inkamnkam bamabatya abantwana abo thina sihleli asiphangela sithi ubuhlungu kuthi ngoku okay ubuhle wabena soze ndibulale ngoba umntanam yeqhela undiphangelela ebezisindisa obuqabane bakhe wayezisindisa kuba ebesebenzela inkululeko le wena ubungayisebenzeli busebenzela amabhulu wena nabazali bakho nabantwana bakho ngiyaqonda ukuthi uthaphela ndithi mthandazo into yokuthaphela izogama ngiyabona ngiyaqonda igama lakho ndalo mazathu ulilandela noba kulilandelanga mna olungumama kaChristopher le ndiyakuxolela mntana kuba ke ndiyaqonda uba umntana ngenye noChristopher ngumntana kubo ndiyakuxolela mntanam kuba ke unobangela ndithi ndiyakuxolela umntana makazongasavuka songaphinda avuke akuncedi noba sokuthiwa isibambile isilonda sawo ndakufana so thixo uyondigweba ngaloo nto uba kuthiwa baxolela abasonayo njengoba nathi sibaxolela ke ndiyakuxolela thaphela ndifuna ukuthi noba uyahamba uyagoduka ukuthi noko oomama ndiyaqonda nakamama uyazixolela zonke into sozala siziyazi bubuhlungu akho ndawo besinakho uzigibisela kufuneka sizigibisele kuwo noba ezinye azenziwanga nguwe sowufana nabo sowucela uyesu ubethelele emnqamezweni ezo zona sesizigibisela ukuthi zixolele kuba ngoku sifuna ukukhupha le nto ilapha kuthi nathi ngengoku sawuthi noba sifike emakhaya sihle siyawuna ngokwelami indawo ndiyakuxolela mntana ndiyaxolela uhambe kakuhle mntana
All right. So, regardless of where you stand on restorative justice, that example is powerful. And I think it shows the potential and the possibility of a well-structured restorative justice process.
Sorry, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
If somebody had a set up there now and just shot your man through the head, what would happen to them? Just bang them, boom.
I assume they would have gone to jail.
But your man wasn't going to jail for what he done, was he?
No. Do you know anything about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? What it did was it had it was a deal. The deal said that if you come forward and you confess your crimes and you provide full information and that your crime was judged to be a political crime, then you were granted amnesty.
So it's basically what we're sort of facing, what may be sought upon people of Northern Ireland that may be coming up very soon.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reason I'm asking. There's somebody that comes forward and say, I shot 3 or 4 people, I'm really sorry about that, is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
And if somebody can't, and their anguish and their anger execute them, they go to jail.
I agree with, I personally agree with what you're saying. In part, what I think is that restorative justice has far too long foregone the idea of punishment and said this can't be a part of restorative justice possibilities. This makes me a bit in the minority of restorative justice type of people and practitioners. Seamus and I have had some debates about this before. But I think one thing is clear, is that simply abstracting a truth and reconciliation model from South Africa and grafting it on to Northern Ireland, probably not going to work. Okay?
The other thing is the reason associations still today are looking for an axe for Nazis who carried the crosses as Jewish people. And that goes on for today. It can't be, I know some people, that's 40 years old, let it go. But to an awful lot of people who need justice, who need truth, what we haven't covered here is the Sharia element of restorative justice. I haven't heard anything at all about Sharia. In Sharia they say, well, what do you want? Do you want a few quarter, do you want blood? Some families will say, give me a few quarter and forget the justice. Other families say, no, I want justice.
Precisely.
So we have to look into that element.
Precisely. It's in the paper. It got kind of abstracted from the presentation. But yeah, you bring up an important point. Do you just want to go into questions now? Because it seems to be where we're going. Is that, I had a scenario, but we can forego that if you want.
Yeah, I think we ought to let Joe finish this scenario.
Let me see what time it is. Yeah. Oh yeah, no, let's just go to questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so briefly questions.
Well, there is, I can think of kind of one, famous face-to-face meeting. We had a man who, as a child, was blinded by a rubber bullet.
Yep.
And as an adult, he met the soldier who fired the rubber bullet, and I think it was a very successful meeting, if you like. And it's sort of parallel to what was shown there, because the man that fired the rubber bullet was just following orders and part of a group and didn't feel, any personal hatred or anything. But I think maybe when we get meetings which involve paramilitaries, they may be more likely to feel that they were justified in what they did, that they had a grievance themselves, that they are victims in a way themselves. What really I found almost unbelievable in that film was how calm everybody was.
Yep.
Because I don't very often hear when people talk about things that have been done to them and members of their families have been killed and so on, they get very, very angry and very loud.
I think one thing
Appreciate your comment, but just we want to leave it open for questions.
One thing I would say in response to that is that you're not looking at a typical exchange. Maybe I should have made that clear. You're not looking at a typical exchange. And you better believe, so in my final slide here, this is a group called Pugamani. If any of you know Brandon Hamber, Brandon Hamber was a consultant for this group. It's a survivors group in Pugamani, and in isiZulu means speak out, right? These people strenuously opposed the TRC. They would show up and they would picket outside of proceedings. And a lot of it was for the reasons that Vincent identified. They weren't happy with this deal that was made. They wanted these people to go to jail. They wanted punishment. Okay? Yeah.
Questions as brief as possible, please.
Yeah, Betty.
So do you see the guy that done the killing? He was obviously working for the state.
He was, yeah.
So there's no way that that's ever going to work, because the state isn't going to come to the families and say, we want it on their own. So it's never going to, because it was actually the state that had him in his pocket, and you can imagine the fear that he went through to as well. It's,
He says something in the beginning of the video that I think is very interesting, but I didn't have time to show. He says basically, I don't have a choice but to do this. I have to go home and I have to live in these communities with my black brothers and sisters. I don't have a choice. The whites, they can go home to their neighborhoods and their segregated communities, and they don't have to focus on how they're going to have to continue to live together. I do. Let me also suggest that these first few questions, we've been focusing a bit on the kind of what would this look like if we applied it full sail to Northern Ireland. Let me also suggest that there's ways to look at restorative justice at the interface, across the interface, in our own kind of daily life and practice as well. Okay? Yeah.
Joe, just again, I suppose it's referring back to the film, but it can, we haven't got a model here in Northern Ireland, but it just sort of crossed my mind that gentleman, who's getting more out of that? Is it right that he feels better for doing this? Do you know what I mean? I don't, he's getting, do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yep, I do. I would say that what the mothers got out of that, this might be familiar to people. What happened with the Guguletu 7, there was an investigation and a whitewash, right? And the state claimed that they were all terrorists and that they had been shot for a good reason. However, what Mbello did, and he was the only person to do it, 25 officers were accused of this crime. Only 2 of them came forward, and Mbello was the only one who told the truth. And he said before the TRC that they were totally innocent. He shot Christopher in the face while he was trying to surrender, and that nothing that they had done deserved that action. So the mothers got that. They got truth. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, there are 2 ways restorative. There are some minor crimes like our PSNI or even in England. They are just giving warning and they are not recorded.
Mm-hmm.
The case you have cited, personally he killed person for the money. I think there should be no restoration there, technically.
He doesn't think that he could have
One
just
part,
for money.
because if he comes out, or if then he might do the same thing again. Other life gone,
Hmm?
why? That's my question.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir.
What your view, can restorative justice work in a situation where you don't have an agreed definition of victim and an agreed definition of justice?
Short answer, no with a but. Long answer, no with a maybe. Basically, let's go no with the but. Restorative justice depends, as it does here so far, on an agreed upon victim. An agreed upon person who wasn't given a choice to have his or her agency taken away. They may have committed other crimes in the past, but for this particular instance that we're looking at, their status as a victim is unassailable. I think that's necessary for restorative justice intervention as we stand now. Yeah. Let me see if anybody else wants to go. Yes, Nigel.
An excellent presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We look at the work of restorative justice carried out by alternatives in North, South, East West, Belfast and CRJ in Ireland. And we look at those people who would normally come to the attention of the prescribed armed groups. And the facts are there that there's been a major decrease in paramilitary punishment attacks. Surely that has to be welcomed. And we also look at, we talked earlier on about the courts and the justice system, and we look at the Justice Inspectorate, who actually have now endorsed the workings of both Alternatives Northern Ireland and CRJ. And with the working relationships that there is now with communities, victim, survivor, offender and PSNI, and we look at the close liaison that there is with the court system, where a lot of what's called, referred to as antisocial behaviour, it's awfully out, rather than take up the court time, etc., etc. 9 out of 10 cases are actually resolved to a very, very high standard. What would your views be on the workings of Alternatives Northern Ireland and CRJ Ireland?
My preliminary response is I'm not qualified to answer that because I haven't studied them in detail. However, I would say that anything that can be proven to be effective at decreasing punishment beatings, at deterring antisocial behavior and reintegrating that might be a good thing, as long as it's not causing further problems down the road. But that's a matter for empirical study. I do personally think that there is a role for the PSNI to play in these communities. What that role is at this point, I'm not entirely certain. And as you know, a lot of it's going to be about repairing the relationships between deprived communities in Northern Ireland and the PSNI in the first place. But I think that the PSNI would largely welcome attempts, organic type of initiatives, restorative justice or whatever, for the community itself to figure out a way forward for what affects the community itself, right? and if they can help in some way. Does that answer your question?
It does too,
Yeah.
because you touched
Yeah.
on earlier on the interfaces.
Yeah.
You know, we look here at our own city,
Yeah.
but we look at other interface areas where there's major issues, especially in North Belfast.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep,
And
absolutely.
the police involvement,
Mm-hmm.
which is actually helping to mediate,
Yep.
to resolve.
Yep.
So obviously you're 100% right, the PSI
Yeah.
have to be fully involved in any aspect of restorative.
And one of the things that I had in this scenario that, I'll pass out, you can look at the end, was sometimes we have a thing called due process here, and the rule of law, and that means that, in theory, and that means that the police have steps that they have to take, right? So for example, one of the things was like, if there's sectarian graffiti or sectarian attacks, the police are charged with investigating that as a hate crime. And if they're charged with investigating that as a hate crime, that circumscribes the restorative possibilities, or it can. So in that sense, I'm kind of talking out of my element here, but in that sense, it might be more difficult to involve the PSNI if they have strictures and rules that they have to follow. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I'd agree.
Robin, yeah.
Yeah, I'm from PS and I'd agree exactly with what you
Yeah.
said. The issue being that statute law doesn't cover everything that offends, and also, whilst restorative cautioning is an option for hate crime, it has to be sanctioned by the Public Prosecution Service,
Yeah.
and it is not an automatic foregone conclusion. We cannot promise somebody they will get a restorative result because it's subject to the PPS discretion.
Yeah.
So that's where we're sort of caught by the rules and strictures, as you said.
Yeah, and a state organization simply has less flexibility because they're ruled by statute. And restorative justice possibilities depends on, in theory, it depends on a whole universe of potential restorative or reparative possibilities that sometimes involving the police or the statutory bodies in can circumscribe.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
How far back in time do you go to apply restorative justice? Do you restrict it
Very good
to
question.
living victims and their immediate relatives, or do you go back further in history?
Very good question. The answer to that is nobody knows. But it's a really good question, and one that should be asked. Yeah.
Excuse me, just in society that needs restorative justice, does that mean the policing and the court system just doesn't work? That we actually need restorative justice?
I don't know. I don't think I would frame it as quite that sharp, quite that distinct. And I think, as I said, this paper doesn't do a whole lot of conclusions. Mainly, we raise questions that hopefully other people in the future can begin to answer. I think that the questions are really important to be asked. I think that in the societies in which we live in today, whether this be in the U.S. or in Northern Ireland, the idea that we can go and find our own organic justice process without involving elected organs of government is a bit of a pipe dream. Is a bit of a pipe dream. The question is how and in which ways can our involvement with them be beneficial, and more importantly, how and in which ways do we need to resist? Do we need to resist that encroachment by the state? Because we do need to resist a bit. But it's not as simple as saying one or the other. That would be my response. Yeah, let's take one minute.
I have 2 points. I'll try to be quite concise, but they're related. One, you showed the prisoners talking together, having a discussion about how crime hurts people. And I said, well, sometimes it might not be like that. Sometimes they might not feel.
They might not feel remorse. Yeah.
Because they're very often the perpetrators are poorer. So, for instance, you take the person that vandalizes my house or my garden, and I'm satisfied that they have fixed things. They're still not satisfied because they say that person has money, that person could have fixed it themselves, that person has insurance and so on. And they might even have some grievance, like maybe I had sacked their father, or my father had sacked their father in some company they owned, or something like that.
Let me read you a quote in response to that. This one.
The related thing is, when I mentioned about the man who was blinded by a plastic bullet, he actually, when he grew up, he started a very, I think we would...
Children
put
across
our
Ireland.
children across Ireland,
Okay.
to help children in situations of conflict. Why do you think there are quite a lot of victims, they don't feel guilty,
Yeah.
but they still feel the best response for them as victims is for them to make restorations, for them to go out and do things that try to remediate,
okay,
peace.
I'll try to make my response to that quickly. There's a literature on this thing called post-traumatic growth, which some victims, after they experience trauma, they use the experience of trauma to go out and work and try to make their societies a better place. We don't understand why and how which people do that, or which people that works for, or how that happens. It's not normal, it happens sometimes. As regard for your point about lacking or missing the story of the offender, I would suggest that a good restorative justice process also allows that story to be told. And let me read you this quote by Niles Christie, who's one of the forefathers of, I love Niles Christie. He talks about what restorative justice is without this type of stories you're talking about. It's a loss of pedagogical possibilities. It is a loss of opportunities for a continuing discussion of what represents the law of the land. How wrong was the thief? How right was the victim? When the victim is small and the offender big in size or in power, how blameworthy is the crime? Or if he is black, or if he is young, or if the other party is an insurance company, or if his wife has just left him, or if his factory will break down and he has to go to jail, or if his daughter will lose his fiancé, or if he was drunk, or if he was sad, or if he was mad. If we don't think about all those things when we're looking at restorative justice, if we don't seek to paint a holistic picture, then we're making the same error that the criminal justice system does, which is only considering this one crime in abstraction. Guilt or innocence. Yes.
Okay. We are a society emerging from conflict. We have our language, dealing with the past, justice, restorative justice, victims. I think you now know why we want Joe to stay here, because he is helping us to say, what do you mean? In order to get it right and in order to avoid doing harm. Joe came here specifically around one aspect of the fact that we're 100 years on from events that shaped the whole century and leaves its shadow. The issue of memorializing memory, and the dead and so on. We have more questions for Joe than how to remember the dead. We have this. Joe, thank you, and thanks everybody.
Thanks, Shane.